Brigitte, tell me about your family and what it was like to be raised as a young child in Lebanon.
I was born and raised in South Lebanon, in a little town called Marjayoun, on the border with Israel. My parents were married for 22 years. They were not able to have any children, and my mother was 55 years old, and my father was 60 when I was born. I was fortunate to live with two parents that loved me and dedicated their life to me. They were retired by that time because they had me in later years. My father was running a restaurant. He owned a restaurant and a lot of real estate. So I was raised in a place where I got to meet a lot of members in the community who came there to eat or to visit with my parents and have a cup of coffee. And I was able to hear adult conversation, talking about politics, talking about religion, talking about the situation in the Middle East. And as usual, we always had a war going on or a conflict going on. Even though I was raised in a Christian country, we were very much still influenced by Arabic opinion. We were very much influenced by the Arabic countries surrounding us. And we spoke Arabic, we practiced the Arabic culture. So we thought like the Arabs thought. We thought Israel was bad. I was taught growing up as a child that Israel, Azrael, Israel is Satan. The Jews are demons. They are barbaric. They are the source of the problems in the Middle East. And the only time we will have peace in the Middle East is when we kill all the Jews and drive them into the sea. That's what I heard on television. That's what I heard on the radio. That's what I saw people talk about when they would come to my father's restaurant and they would be sitting around the tables talking. That was the opinion of the Lebanese people at the time. We listened to the media that was governed by our government, so we only heard what our government wanted us to hear. As usual in the Middle East, it's always a one-sided story. You never hear the other side because all the media and all the Arabic countries are manipulated by the government. I went to a Christian private school, and even in my private school, in my Bible class, we never studied the Old Testament. Our Bibles did not include the Old Testament because the Old Testament was considered the enemy's book. It was the Torah, and the Bible had nothing to do with it.
Tell me a little bit about the population of Lebanon. Who's who and who was what back then?
When we got our independence from France in the 1940s, the majority of the population in Lebanon were Christians. The Muslims were the minority. As the years passed by, that population shifted because we do not have as many children as the Muslims do. The Christians got married to one spouse until death do us part. We have maybe 3, 4 children, while the Muslims are allowed to marry up to 4 wives at a time according to their religion. So they would marry multiple wives and they would have a lot of children. The most famous Muslim in the world today is Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden is 1 out of 53 children. He himself has 27 children. Between father and son, they have produced 80 children. How many Christian families do you know that have 80 children? It's just impossible. We don't do that. And that's what shifted the population in Lebanon. The Muslims multiplied at a much faster pace than we did. And after 20, 30 years of that, they became the majority, we became the minority. Even though we held the positions of professionals, we were more educated simply because we did not have as many children, so we were able to send our kids to college. Education was very, very important to us. The Muslims, on the other hand, simply by the sheer fact as having many children, they were not able to educate their children as much as we were able to educate ours. And it was just a completely different culture within a culture. It was a very different 2 segments of society.
What was another factor that affected the balance between the Christians and the Muslims in Lebanon?
Another factor that affected the balance was the influx of the Palestinians out of Jordan and into Lebanon in 1970. Yasser Arafat and the Palestinians tried to throw King Hussein out of power. Yasser Arafat wanted to create a base in which to fight Israel. When he failed to do that in Jordan and King Hussein kicked them out into Lebanon, we took them in. We already had Palestinian refugee camps set up. So the majority of the Palestinians that came from Jordan into Lebanon were Muslims. We already had a problem in the balance already in Lebanon between the Christians and the Muslims, but with the influx of the Palestinians into Lebanon, them being Muslims, it aggravated the problem. And Yasser Arafat tried to do in Lebanon exactly what he tried to do in Jordan, create another base in which to fight Israel. And he succeeded. And in order to do that, he had to control the population. So he put his head together with the Muslims in Lebanon, and together they declared jihad on the Christians, and that's how the civil war started.
Well, when did things take a turn for the worse for you and your family?
Things started changing for us, as far as I remember, around 1974. Every year we used to go spend the holidays in Beirut with the rest of my family because it was only my mom and my dad lived in Marjayoun. And we stopped going. And I would ask my father, how come we're not spending Christmas in Beirut with the rest of the family? And he would give me some lame excuse like, well, we decided to stay home this Christmas. And I could not understand as a child. Later I found out that the reason why we were staying home is because the Muslims and the Palestinians started setting up checkpoints. They created a combined army called Jaysh Lebanon al-Arabi, which was the Arabic-Lebanese army. And it was the combination of the Palestinians and the Lebanese Muslims. And they would set up checkpoints in the middle of the night, in the middle of the roads. And if they see a Christian, they would stop cars, and they would get people out of the car, and they would look at their ID. And if the ID said that this family is a Christian, because in Lebanon, we were identified on our IDs. Our religion was either Christian, Muslim, or Jewish. And we didn't have many Jews by that time. But when they would find out that this was a Christian family, they would get them out of the car and kill them, shoot the whole family. The word spread very fast, and Christians became prisoners to their own towns and their own communities. We were afraid to travel. But the major thing that changed my life was the bombing of my home. When the Lebanese Arabic army was trying to take over the military bases in Lebanon, they had taken over all the military bases with the exception of the military base above my home. They bombed that military base in an attempt to take it over. They missed the military base, and all their rockets exploded in my home, bringing it down and burying me under the rubble. I was wounded, and I ended up spending 2.5 months in the hospital. And I remember as a child asking my parents, why did they do this to us? And my father would always say, because we are Christians. They're trying to kill us. And I knew ever since I was a child that I am wanted dead simply because I was a Christian who happened to live in a Christian town.
What was life like after you came back from the hospital?
When I came back home, home was no longer the home that I left because my home was half destroyed. My new home became a bomb shelter underground with no electricity, no water, and very little food. My mother and I used to have to go out and hunt for grass and dig dandelions and any green vegetation that grew around our bomb shelter to eat. My mother would soak chickpeas overnight and rice and beans so we can eat that the next day. To get some water, we would crawl to a nearby spring to fetch some water, and we would crawl under snipers' bullets. And when we would get to the spring, we would be hiding behind the wall, and my mother would hold the gallon to fill it with water, and she would put a stocking on top of it to catch all the worms and all the maggots and all the rocks so we can drink the water. And then we would crawl back to the bomb shelter. Sometimes it would take us hours because of the sniper who was terrorizing us. And that went in and day out, year in and year out. Our life became unbearable. We had no electricity, so we had no heat. We were living underground in a cold, damp bomb shelter. During the day, we would let little rays of lights that would sneak in through the door and through the holes in the little window that we had. And at night,